Hi, so my name's Andrew Dudley and this is Earth Live, a webcast featuring interviews with people working on the front lines of conservation and human rights. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Hinojosa, Executive Director of the United States Customs and Border Protection. Thank you for joining us, Anna.
Thank you for inviting me, Andrew. It's a pleasure.
Can you briefly describe your work at US Customs and Border Protection?
Sure. Well, as you are probably aware, Customs and Border Protection is a very large organization within the U.S. government. We have a lot of broad responsibilities for enforcing our laws at the borders, and most people associate Customs and Border Protection with the uniformed officers that are the ones that receive you when you come to our country at our airports, or processing cargo when the cargo is coming through, or even some of our Border Patrol agents who are in green uniforms working in between our ports of entry and conducting that enforcement. We work for the Office of Trade, and in my particular directorate, we're focused on a number of different areas, investigating areas of illicit activity and policy issues related to enforcement, and in particular, as it relates to the topic of forced labor. Our office is responsible for investigating allegations of forced labor in the production of goods that are presented for importation into the United States.
Thank you, Anna. Now, in 2020, you guys issued a withhold release order against the Malaysian palm oil exporter Sime Darby. Can you describe what a withhold release order is and how your investigation came about?
Sure. So in the United States, we have had a law for a very long time that has prohibited the importation of goods produced in whole or in part with forced labor. That law dates back to 1930. However, from 1930 up until 2016, there was a clause in that law that indicated that we were to prohibit the entry of these goods, provided that the U.S., except for if the U.S. did not produce enough quantities of those goods to satisfy consumer demands. And so, as you can imagine, that created a bit of a loophole for enforcement. And so it wasn't until 2016 that our Congress eliminated that clause and gave us the opportunity to take more effective enforcement action. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection is one, if not the only at this point, customs administration that has border enforcement authority over this type of problem with the way goods are produced, with the issue of goods produced with forced labor. Many countries have laws in place to address goods produced with forced labor, but generally that enforcement is done by other ministries and not necessarily at the border, as is done in the United States as one of our layers of addressing this particular issue. So getting to your question about the withhold release order, so our law and our associated regulations, I think it's important to note that in the United States, and we in 1993 changed our laws so that our importers of record have a lot of responsibilities. So in 1993, with our Customs Modernization Act, we passed a law that indicates that importers are responsible to exercise reasonable care to ensure that the goods that they bring to the United States are in compliance with all laws, rules, and regulations. And this is important because it affects how we are able to manage our cross-border movement of goods. So when Customs and Border Protection receives allegations or has information, whether it be from civil society organizations, investigative journalists, the public at large, other government agencies, or even in some cases our own analysts will do a lot of open source researching and self-generate some investigations. When we have established reasonable suspicion that certain goods are produced in whole or in part with forced labor, then we use a procedure internally to issue what is called a withhold release order. This withhold release order is it's basically a direction to our ports of entry that says, please withhold release of this particular merchandise. merchandise matching the description of what we have identified is reasonably but not necessarily conclusively produced with forced labor. So once we've issued that withhold release order, we have been publicizing that information so that the trade community has some advance information as to where there's higher risk of forced labor, and there's an understanding that if those goods arrive at our borders, then we will be detaining those goods and asking further questions. So what happens is once that withhold release order has been issued, our ports of entry will be looking for these goods, and when they arrive, those goods will be detained. The importer of record will receive a notice of detention that will outline why those goods are being detained and who to contact for further information, what kind of information is required in order to gain the release of those goods. All of that is outlined in the detention notice. And then the responsibility shifts to the importer of record. The importer of record is then required to provide conclusive evidence that the goods that we have detained are not made with forced labor, in whole or in part with forced labor.
So we understand that your investigation discovered the presence of 11 Ilo indicators of forced labor. Can I ask what an Ilo indicator is?
Sure. An Ilo indicator is one of the indicators that the International Labor Organization has prescribed as different factors that to be able to look out for on what could potentially constitute modern day slavery, or where workers these are some samples, some areas to look for when workers may be subjected to human rights violations that then constitute forced labor. Some examples of those ILO indicators. They have a fabulous publication on their website, so we will make sure to send you the link so that you can share that with your viewers as well.
Thank you.
And it is available in different languages on the ILO website. But some of the examples of some of these indicators are deception, where workers are recruited to come work in a particular area, in a particular place, under false pretenses, and then when they arrive, the work that they're expected to do is different than what was sold to them when they got them to come over. Some of the other areas are restriction of movement, where people are not allowed to leave, or in some cases people are have their identity documents taken from them, and so that in many countries restricts the movement of people. Isolation, keeping people from having access to communication or transportation or other people that could potentially help them in situations where their rights are being violated. Some of the cases that we've seen quite pervasively, unfortunately, are debt bondage, where people are recruited and they have to pay in advance for this work, and once and that debt continues to grow, and they're paid so little that in reality it's almost impossible for them to back the debt that they have, and so they're in this debt bondage. So in some cases, this debt is passed down from a parent to a child or a nephew or another family member, because the debt is so high. We have abuse of vulnerability. In many cases, are examples where if you have migrant workers coming from one country to another, or very rural, impoverished workers coming up into other areas of a country, and there is a different language, there is there's illiteracy or lack of understanding of some of the terms in the employment contracts, lack of understanding of what the roles and responsibilities and what's being promised. Mm-hmm. Some of that, it's really abusing the vulnerability of the person because they don't have a strong understanding of the language or an academic preparation to be able to read and fend for themselves. And of course, we've seen violence, sexual violence, intimidation, So those are just a couple of examples of some of the things that we have found in our investigations over many different cases.
Mm-hmm. So these are very serious issues that were present in Sime Darby's supply chain. So how were you able to establish that they were present?
In many cases, many of the petitions that we received contain quite a bit of evidence, and we are able to corroborate that evidence, whether it's pictures, videos, affidavits from witnesses or victims, and those are how we go about corroborating that information.
And moving forward, what does Sime Darby need to do to remedy the situation with you guys?
So for any of the companies any of the manufacturers or entities that we have issued a withhold release order on, those that have looked to remediate the forced labor conditions in their manufacturing or production process, for the forced labor indicators that we have identified as having been present in their production, we would look for them to fully remediate each and every one of the ones that we have found. So if we have found, for example, a dead bondage situation, we would expect that they take steps to remediate that. If there's problems with excessive overtime or terrible living conditions, we would expect them to address each and every one of the forced labor indicators.
And we hear some multinational companies claim that the issue of slave labor, for example, is too complex to solve. What's your thoughts on this, and what advice would you give such companies?
Well, definitely, I think that it is a very complex problem, and businesses in particular have a very important responsibility, because they are the key to whether or not they tolerate this type of activity in their supply chains. Businesses have every bit of say in who they do business with and where they spend their money, and so do consumers. And so consumers are becoming very aware of what's happening in the manufacturing of products, and they are becoming very conscientious as well. And consumers don't want products that are produced on the backs of poor people who are being abused in order to produce them. So I think more and more there's a more social awareness of what's happening, and I think businesses have a responsibility to know what's happening in the manufacturing process of the goods that they're producing.
Yeah. And maybe another question would be, what responsibilities do US importers have when it comes to forced labor?
Absolutely. U.S. importers have an absolute responsibility for ensuring that the goods that they are bringing to the United States are in compliance with all U.S. laws and regulations, including the forced labor statute. So they have an affirmative responsibility to ensure that those goods are not produced in whole or in part with forced labor. And we've done quite a bit over the last, certainly, couple of years of really highlighting some of the risks and concerns out there.
What advice would you give other governments wanting to take a tougher stance on companies of slave labor in their supply chains?
Well, I think that many other governments are also becoming more aware of just how much forced labor there is around the world. We in the U.S. are certainly open to collaborating with other governments and sharing our experiences with them. We think it's important that this not be a U.S. crusade, that when the U.S. prohibits the entry of goods that we believe are produced with forced labor, those goods are going to be marketed in other countries, and consumers in other countries as well are not interested in buying products that are made with forced labor. I think many other countries are becoming much more aware and are also very much publicly condemning these practices and highlighting their strong stance against modern day slavery and against the abuses of workers.
And just how important is whistleblowing to your work, and what advice would you give a person with information?
Well, whistleblowing or submissions of petitions or allegations of forced labor in certain supply chains is extremely important in our work. We are very much interested in finding out about goods that are produced with forced labor that are coming to the United States. And if people are aware of any instances where goods are being produced with forced labor, we highly encourage them to send us that information. We have an electronic portal, our e-allegations portal, as well as a toll-free phone number that people could call if they have this information. It's certainly helpful if they have any examples or any pictures or videos or other evidence to submit. But we're not wanting people to put themselves in danger. But certainly send us the information, and we will do our best to look into it.
And finally, what steps can consumers take to help end modern slavery?
Consumers have the strongest power in this effort. I think that voicing their preferences, voicing their objections to purchasing goods produced with forced labor are extremely important to businesses who are procuring the manufacturing of these goods. And it's important for consumers to say we won't buy those products because we believe they're produced with forced labor. If consumers do a little bit of homework on the internet, take a look at information of what the goods that are listed in both the Department of Labor's list of goods produced with child and forced labor, certainly our website that contains our withhold release orders of where we found goods that we believe are produced with forced labor, and even the State Department's goods trafficking in persons report also gives quite a bit of information as to where there's a very high risk of products being produced with forced labor. Educate yourself, do some internet researching. There's a lot of information on the internet because there are such great investigative reporters and human rights activists around the world that are highlighting these abuses, and you are able as a consumer to find out if the products that you're buying are sustainably produced and produced while protecting the human rights of the workers that are producing them.
So Anna, we want to thank you for the amazing work that you are doing and your organization, and wish you the very best of luck in the future moving forward.
Andrew, thank you very much for having me on your show. Really appreciate the opportunity to share our work with your audience.